Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. I'm Sean Michael Morris. I'm the acting head of pedagogy at GPT Zero and the host for today's webinar on AI and ethics. This webinar is part of a series that will take place from today until mid-June, and which makes up some of the content for GPT Zero's Teaching Responsibly with AI certificate program. Today's webinar will look at understanding the ethical questions of AI in education, addressing academic integrity in an AI-powered world, and the role AI detection can play in authentic learning. GPT-Zero is hosting the certificate program and webinar series in order to build awareness and skills amongst teachers about the responsible use of AI at all levels of teaching and learning. In keeping with the mission of preserving what's human in education, the focus here is on your work in your classroom. As part of the GPT-Zero commitment to authentic teaching and learning, the company is also happy to offer everyone who attends today's webinar free access to an educator account on GPT-Zero. At the end of the webinar, I'll provide a link you can use to sign up, so stay tuned. Our speaker today is Antonio Bird. Antonio is an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a member of the MLA 4C's task force on artificial intelligence. In that role, he's charged to develop resources, guidelines, and professional standards around the use of AI and writing for English teachers. In other words, he's the perfect speaker for our webinar, and it's a privilege to have him with us. As we get started, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and to use that space to connect with each other. If you have questions for today's speaker, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to post them. There are a lot of folks in attendance today, so the Q&A function is probably the best way for us to keep questions organized and to answer as many as possible. And now, without further ado, please welcome Antonio Bird to the stage. Antonio, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us for this first event in the webinar series. I will go ahead and share my screen so everyone can go ahead and take a look at that. In this particular webinar to kick things off, it's called What Happens After the Detection? Managing Awkward Conversations with Students About Gen AI Use. And in this particular presentation, we're going to talk about really some strategies on how we can be thoughtful when we're using AI detectors, but also being very thoughtful and also ethical in how exactly we want to approach our students after they may have used generative AI in a way that was inappropriate to your own policies, whether that was your classroom or your own institutions. So first, I'll talk a little bit about engaged pedagogy as a way to create trust between yourself and your students. Develop different types of activities that's going to first build trust in a community of learners. And then afterwards, we're thinking about this concept that's called rhetorical listening. It's this idea that comes from my own discipline in rhetoric, where we're really trying to think about thoughtful engagement with students when they're using generative AI inappropriately, or we think they have used it inappropriately based on the results from an AI detector. And then finally, one thing that's really big is centering how exactly AI does or does not align with the values that you actually bring to your classroom, and also the values that your students have when they come to your classroom. So I'm going to first kind of like set things up with the exigency, just demonstrating some research that shows that it's very difficult for us to really tell the difference between AI and human-generated text. And then we'll talk about engaged pedagogy and what that actually looks like in terms of setting up your class, preparing it for the use of generative AI or the inappropriate use of generative AI, and where you use AI detector in that particular scenario. And then I'll show you what rhetorical listening is and what it looks like. And then I'll show you a few scenarios. And then finally, what I'm going to suggest are some other approaches that you could take in talking about Gen AI misuse with your own students. So I do want to say that first and foremost, there would be a little bit of interactivity with this particular talk that we're going to have. I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can use the chat to respond to those questions. I know we have a lot of people in this particular webinar right now, so it is okay if we're like flooding the chat. I can see right now we have 99 plus chats going on right now. I am really excited that we have so many people and they can use this opportunity to connect. So hopefully you get some ideas as you kind of like jump through some of the ideas that other people are actually sharing. So we'll go ahead and jump into things. First, there are some sources, and some of these might actually be useful to you a little bit later on. That really informs my own thinking on how to think about AI detectors and how they fit in having a conversation with our students about using generative AI. There is the Student Guide to AI Literacy by the MLAC's task force, and that is actually available on the task force website. Practicing Gen AI Refusal in Writing Studies is a WordPress blog that actually provides some really great resources in terms of how to talk to students about AI and how you can actually take a particular stance where you're very critical of the use of generative AI while also helping students understand how these tools really work and how they interrupt their learning, or in some cases may help their learning. That's always like I think a mixed area of research right now. And then finally, if you're thinking about policies for your classrooms, working paper 2 from the MLAC's task force is also very useful. I know that for some people, they've said that this is kind of like dense. So we actually have a blog post that's on our website for the MLAC's task force that goes into a little more of a summary of how to think about policy. All of these things, of course, you can find if you just Google MLAC's task force on AI, you'll find our website should be the first thing that comes up. All right, telling the difference is actually really hard. So this is going to be your first question for the chat in terms of being a little bit interactive. How do you distinguish between authentic human writing and Gen AI generated AI text? So I'm going to go ahead and monitor chat and see how folks kind of answer. And I know there's going to be like a huge flood, but I'm really excited to see how people kind of jump in with things. Okay. Sometimes people saying like no grammatical errors because there's always errors in our students' writing, right? Uh, that is definitely a giveaway. Sometimes when I have errors in the online teaching, I teach on Canvas. So when there's text that has some errors in it that I've done, I sometimes turn around and say, "Oh, you know that your teacher wrote this because like there are obvious errors in my own writing." AI writing from Joanna says AI writing comes across in a broadness without the depth of specificity that a human piece of writing offers. And I think that's a really good point because there is research that shows that, at least with GPT 3.5, there's a tendency for that particular kind of AI to really assume that there's no conversation to be had. Usually, when students are developing as writers, they have this shift where they finally have more audience awareness and they show that awareness in their writing. They may say things like maybe or maybe they're very direct with it and they say that they're open to more conversations or this is what needs to happen next for the research project that I have actually done. Students realize they're in a community and that there's a potential for pushback or conversation. But with you look at the language for, say, GPT 3.5, there's a tendency to be very certain, of course, with its answer, but also assume like there's no conversation that needs to be had, that it has a definite conclusion. I have solved the thing. Look at the text I've written, and there's nothing more that you actually need to do. Um, and there's also a tendency not to explain anything, making the assumption that people understand words when they read that text. We as human beings tend to follow things up with examples or clarifications. And without any kind of human intervention, AI tends to just kind of like do its own thing. Uh, Daryl says text is way above the student's knowledge level, a lack of voice. I compare my students' written work with their electronic submissions. Very good. Yeah. Sometimes there are those telltale signs, right? Well, there's different types of research that came out in 2024 that really puts teachers to the test on whether or not they can actually identify AI generated text or not. So, this particular research article, who wrote this? Detecting Artificial Intelligence Generated Text from Human Written Text. In this particular research, they, gave teachers different types of text, some human written, others AI written. And about 63% of the time, the teacher could actually identify a text as human written. But 24% of the time, they were only able to identify AI written text, which means a lot of the AI written text was getting, quote, past them, right? They weren't able to actually tell the difference. And so what's happening slowly, I think, is that large language models are getting a little bit better in trying to resemble how human beings actually write. And then here's just one other study that I want to show with you. This is just comparing experienced writer or teachers and novice teachers, teachers who are just new to the work of teaching in public schools. And there were 89 teachers and 200 experienced teachers. And what Fleckenstein found is that these teachers had trouble identifying AI generated text. Although they did find that if you're a little bit more experienced, you have a better success. Not 100%, but you do a little bit better job recognizing, I think this is AI generated text. And that comes from just like the actual experience of reading a lot of student writing. So using AI detectors kind of gets a little bit more complex because sometimes, at least at the very beginning when ChatGPT came onto the scene, we could kind of like tell the difference between, is this human written or is this synthetically written? And we can use an AI detector and try to make that kind of determination. But this particular chart that comes from the Framework for the Future, Building AI Literacy in Higher Education from Moxie, has really made me rethink how I should understand writing in a time when we actually have uh, AI and it's helping us with, quote, supposedly helping us with our writing, right? And there's a spectrum between where the human being is doing the writing all the way to the synthetic writing. And in between, there's this kind of trade-off where it's either the human being who's doing all of the lead-in with the actual writing, or it's the machine in the loop where the student just gives the AI, hey, here's the prompt. Now generate an essay for me, and then they'll go in and make little changes. So there's a difference right now between how a machine leads the actual writing and how a human being leads the writing. And so what that means is that when we're using AI detectors, it's no longer just between the human and the synthetic, but thinking about how are these actually being collaborated with between both the student and the machine at the same time. So it's kind of like the rhetorical context. Like, when are people actually using AI simply for that synthetic writing in our classrooms? And when is it a chance for the student to actually be using AI where they're just kind of like going through it, making changes to it so that way it actually works for them? So this just makes the use of AI detectors not as direct and straightforward because we're no longer trying to find just synthetic writing, but some combination of human beings and machines writing together. So I think it's really important to kind of like think about what happens when we actually want to use an AI detector. What's the purpose that we're actually using it for? And so here are just three different questions that I would propose that you kind of like consider as you're thinking about using AI detectors. So, for example, first and foremost, really centering everything that you do around the teaching that you want to do, around the learning goals and outcomes that you have for your students. How are AI detectors going to support your learning and your students' learning? Second, what's the purpose of using AI detectors? And can you really articulate this purpose to your own students? And I think that's really important to be very transparent and be very honest about what the goal is for actually using AI detectors. And then finally, and this is something that I'm really big on, think about your relationships with your students. How might AI detectors disrupt or enhance that trust and transparency that you really want in your student-teacher relationships? And I think this is really important, partly because I've been doing some research here at UMKC. And I've sent out a survey and I've been doing some interviews with our undergraduates, and this is across all of the disciplines. And in this survey, one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of students have a lot of fear in their classrooms. They don't want to use AI, partly because they're afraid they're going to get caught by an AI detector. And so what that really means to me is that they really don't want to know anything about what AI does or anything like they kind of like cut themselves off. And for me as a teacher, at least, I try not to lead by fear. I really want that relationship. I really want that openness and transparency if anyone is using AI. And so for me personally, sometimes I have to really think about like where does AI detectors fit within my kind of relationship that I want to have with students. So it's important to be very clear about the goal for using AI detectors and what are the next steps if you are using those types of tools. I think the biggest thing, and you can find this in that refusal blog post that I had posted, the most important thing is to avoid surveillance pedagogy. You know, we are teachers. We, at least for me, myself, I don't want to like lift an eyebrow at my students all the time, trying to kind of track and look into what they're doing throughout the writing process. I think surveillance pedagogy can be disruptive to our ability to actually teach and for students to learn. We spend more time trying to catch students in doing something wrong and not so much as using the power of learning and teaching to kind of help them kind of understand what it is that they're doing, especially when they're using AI. My own argument is really that AI detectors is a good use for starting a conversation, not making a final decision, like instantly saying, well, that's an F because AI detector said that you use AI 100%. But really just kind of like pause for a moment and think, well, this text is not the text that I want from this student. What's going on here? And so that's what we really want to do as a way to think about the ethical use of AI and AI detectors. So you might be wondering, well, how do we start a conversation then? Especially if you may teach five, six, seven classes, whether that's in college. My background is in public education, and so I know what it's like to teach six back-to-back classes, and then you never actually get a break until that seventh period. That was my experience before I started teaching college. So how exactly do I start a conversation, especially if I have so many students? What do I exactly do? And so this covers what you can do after you have used that AI detector and you want to have a conversation. Now, my biggest argument is pulling things from Bell Hooks, well-known Black feminist scholar who was a really big advocate for teachers and students having a relationship. So here is a question that you can kind of pose in the answer in the chat. How do you set the tone of the learning environment in your classes? What do you do? I like to start off by playing some chill hip hop beats from YouTube. So when students first come into my in-person class, they hear this music because silence is kind of awkward, especially when it's the first day of class and no one's really talking to each other. So it's like, well, let's fill in the silence with some chill hip hop beats. But what do you do? How do you set the tone with students? Icebreakers, making connections with their lives. Marie says, loving the music. Yeah, yeah, it takes away from the awkwardness, doesn't it? And as people are chatting, I see there is one questions about the slides being available. If there is a possibility to make the slides available, I'm happy to kind of do that. Starting with the story. Okay, welcoming them at the door. Yeah, setting friendly vibes. Yeah, setting those vibes are really important. I usually don't start with the syllabus. Usually I start with them and our own relationship with each other first, and then we get to the syllabus a little bit later on because I want to show that us, who we are to each other matters most. All right, so as people are kind of sharing their ideas, we'll go on to the next thing with engaged pedagogy. And Bell Hooks is a big advocate for thinking about how we can kind of find our self-actualized existence in the world. So these are the ideas that I've gleaned from her work, Engaged Pedagogy, in the book Teaching to Transgress. She says that in engaged pedagogy, students are active participants in their education, and all of the concepts that they learn, they can relate it to their own lives. And it starts to help them to think about, okay, what kind of world do I want to live in? I'm not just learning these concepts, I'm not just writing this paper. I'm thinking about how can I actually change the world. Concepts can also be tools for trying to make the world a better place. This is a moment where education really is about transformation and what kind of transformation that we can do. It may sound kind of idealistic, but sometimes, the best ideas are coming out of the classroom. It comes out of higher education, and they really do make changes in the world. And then finally, I love this part that Bell Hooks emphasizes, which is that we are learning with our students, and at the same time, we're all on this journey to find our full potential. That we're not just brains, but we are also body and emotion. And we have to kind of lean into that when we're in the classroom. So, how exactly do I try to set up my classroom so that way they understand first, this is our values and our expectations? And I find this could be one way to try to make the classroom not necessarily AI proof, but it lets students kind of think a little bit about, okay, well, I'm using AI, but what does that really mean for this community that I'm actually in? I myself like to start off by talking about our values. What are the values that we have about the classroom, about learning, and what exactly does that actually look like in the classroom for us? This is almost kind of like a contract or an agreement that we have about how we can all learn together. So I do values affirmation. This is actually a really cool activity that research has shown reduces stereotype threat, especially among marginalized students. It boosts academic achievement and it can create a sense of belonging. So I think sometimes students will use AI in an inappropriate way because of the kind of learning environment that they're in, right? They care more about the grade. They just want to get things done. Maybe the classroom is really strict and they don't find a way for them to get work done and not be too penalized afterwards. This is a way to kind of like set up that classroom environment where you can kind of make mistakes. We're learning together, but we're also coming together on this understanding of where AI kind of fits or doesn't fit. So it's not perfect in terms of creating belonging. It does mean that you change your instructional practices and show a lot of empathy to your students. So ultimately, what you're doing with that values affirmation at the start of class is you're articulating, this is what we expect of each other based on the values that we have. And now we're also showing our commitment to really doing problem solving and critical inquiry, but doing that with integrity. And then also, it's about taking those personal experience and try to transform them into some theories that will help us think about how we actually interact with each other in a community. My thought is that if you know your community and you know your values, then you're better prepared to think about where does AI kind of fit within these values for our classrooms. So here, just for the sake of time, I won't click on the link, but there's a really cool worksheet in case you want to do this activity at the start of your class. It is from California, and you can find other types of activities as well. But there's a really cool worksheet that shows the list of values that students can pick from and choose. And then later on, they think about how important is this value to your life? And then what I usually do is that we then share those expectations with each other. We get like a working list of values, like on a board, or we put it like in a Google Doc if it's an online class, especially. And we kind of like negotiate friendship, creativity, um, constructive criticism. Students have come up with all types of values. And then we ask, what does that look like? What does friendliness look like in our classroom? Constructive criticism, what does that mean and what could that look like? So then that kind of like becomes something that we always go back to when we're thinking about how we treat each other, but also, again, whether or not AI kind of fits within that. And I'll show you in a moment what that looks like here. So once you've done your values, you can start to kind of think about the uses of AI in your classroom, kind of like along this sliding scale. We know our values and what's really important. Cool, that's fantastic and that's great. But now we have to think about like what uses of AI are really acceptable in our classroom based on what we find to be really important. What we're all about is critical inquiry. We want to solve problems, we want to figure things out, we want to understand the world. Does Gen AI help with critical inquiry? What specific things would be okay for us to use? Pain point. These are things that really fails to meet our values and expectations, but it's kind of a minor inconvenience. Like you're looking at a student's paper and the source doesn't actually exist. That's a hallucination. And so you're thinking, well, for me at least, this is annoying. This is a pain point for me. It doesn't ruin the whole experience for me as a reader, but I'm like, okay, this thing doesn't exist at all. And so then you decide as a teacher, do I want to talk to the student about these hallucinations? Is this just a matter of just saying, hey, just so you know, these sources aren't real. This may have been generated from AI, and then you just kind of like leave it alone from there. But I think what's really important is that we decide what's the biggest harms to our values and to what we expect of our students. These harms are true violations where the human being doesn't even isn't even a part of the actual assignment. The student has given you a paper, and that paper is clearly written by AI. That's a serious harm and a violation of your expectations. Maybe the AI detector that you've used says this is 90, it's likely that it's 99% generated by AI. And you say, okay, that is a significant harm to what we do in this classroom. This is where I want to have a conversation with my student about how they used AI. So this could be something that you do with your students. Maybe you come up with different use cases, or maybe this is something that you keep in the back of your head as a teacher when you're using GPT-0 or any other AI detector. What seems to be a real harm and what seems to be an interesting use of AI that supports critical inquiry? Where do you actually stand on that in your own teaching and the policies that you actually create? I find this is very useful because it kind of prevents me from like chasing after every single paper that I see that may have been written by AI. So let's say that we have used GPT-0 or other types of AI detectors, and we have where we want to talk to a student. There's a little too much possibility that this was written by AI. How exactly can we have that conversation? So here's just a question for you. How might academic integrity complaints without thoughtful conversations essentially be the antithesis of engaged pedagogy? We talked about community, transparency, and really connecting with our students. But the scenario is that we jump directly to the AI or to the academic integrity complaint, that we file something with our administrators or we fail them. But we didn't have that conversation. Does that really match with what we expect from engaged pedagogy? Let's take a look at the comments. Lack of trust, not feeling heard. Ooh, I love that. Not feeling heard. And I think that's what we all want. It's what students really want too. There's a story that came out early on, I think a couple years ago, about a student who used Grammarly. And they only used Grammarly for the punctuation, to fix their punctuation. But the teacher who was using an AI detector, the AI detector said like this was generated by AI. And without even really talking to the student, the teacher just filed the academic integrity case, and the student got suspended from the school immediately. There wasn't any kind of conversation. There was no due process for the student. So trust is really important. Being heard is really important. I like what Kate says here. This whole experience with AI is so new that we need to have open conversations among all parties. Yes, we're investigating this new thing together. I love what Kate says here about like this is like us coming together for a conversation. Yes, that's the main thing. If you're using an AI detector, can you use that in a way that you're actually having a conversation with our students? So, academic integrity complaints, some of the risks. So, we want to file the complaint, or we want to, talk to the principal or talk to administration, or even make a decision about the grade that the student gets after we've done a process of real understanding. So, we want to know from the student, what's the context of the inappropriate use? The student's reflection on how Janae use did or did not further the values of the learning community. Hey, we have these values about honesty and integrity, and we said this is what that looks like. You used AI in a way that it seems like there's a lot of this being used in the paper. What's going on here? Do you think this is actually attaching to the things that we expect of our classrooms? And then finally, what's the Gen AI's risk to student learning? There's research that shows that when a student over relies on AI, they don't really learn anything from the experience. Two different groups of students were tested in this one paper. One group used AI to generate an essay. The other group wrote their own essay. And so the students who were using AI, they did a pretty good job with their essay. Um, but the issue is that they learned nothing from the experience. Nothing at all. And this is called metacognitive laziness, where you did the task and you used AI, but you didn't actually learn anything from it. So number three is really important. Did you learn anything from using that? And what exactly did you take away from it? So rhetorical listening could be one way to have that awkward conversation. Um, the idea for rhetorical listening is really understanding the experience of someone's perspective of the world to arrive at some kind of truth. So, what's the student's experience? What do you think about the classroom and about the assignment itself? It's the opposite of passive listening. I think passive listening can lean us towards surveillance pedagogy, where what we really want to do is gather enough evidence that supports our own perspective, and then we immediately give them the F, or we sign the academic integrity file, and we submit that to the administration, right? Um, that's not something that we really want to do. Another way to put it is that if you've been in a meeting and you really want to say something in that meeting, if that other person would just stop talking, then you can say your part. I've done it myself, and I have to be active about not just being so eager to speak. I need to listen, and then I can speak. We do it all the time. It's the same kind of idea behind passive listening. And then the idea behind rhetorical listening is really is understanding diplomacy and communicating across cultures. And the hope is that you reach an ethical decision. Some of you were saying that jumping to that academic complaint or immediately failing the student without that conversation actually disrupts engaged pedagogy. That may not be a true ethical or justice-informed approach. We really want to start the conversation with the student after using the AI detector. So, rhetorical listening actions. This comes from a book called Rhetorical Listening, Identification, Gender, and Whiteness. And these are like the basic ideas. We're listening to understand, we're asking generous questions, and we don't take the conversation personally. We want to see things from the student's perspective as much as possible. And also ask who isn't speaking in this conversation. Make sure we try to invite them in. This is especially true if you want to step back and just have a conversation with the entire class. Maybe you've been using GPT-0 or another AI detector, and you're realizing that there's a consistency in the percentage that may have been used, in which the paper may have been AI generated. Then you may want to have a whole conversation with the student. Wonder who's not actually there. And then open a space for negotiation. What should we do next in this particular moment? I have some ideas on what you can do next afterwards. So I'm trying to keep track of time to make sure that we're aware of have some time for Q&A. My next step here is to provide you with some scenarios. My intent is really probably to do just one for this particular moment, and this allows you to practice rhetorical listening or to offer your own thoughts. So here is just one scenario that we'll do for our time together. In a first year composition course, students write a literacy narrative. That's an autobiographical essay that narrates the author's history with reading, writing, and digital technologies. And it's for their first major writing assignment of the semester. One student's draft has generic details about their experiences with literacy, and the narrative structure moves in typical fashion from disliking reading and writing to appreciating its value at the end. It's a common structure. I used to hate writing, and now I love it. Curious, you visit an AI chatbot and ask it to write a literacy narrative. The story isn't the same, of course, but the style reads similarly generic. So my question to you all in the chat is, what do you think about this? Do you find this to be a harm? Like, this is major. Do you find it to be a pain point? This is kind of a little bit annoying to what we find to be important for academic integrity and learning. But I'll write a little comment and then, move on to the next thing. Or is this a reward to critical inquiry? Oh, this is great. This absolutely supports our interest in problem solving and figuring out how the world works. What do we think? Okay, some people are saying pain point and pain to harm. I'm wondering if anyone wants to say reward to critical inquiry. I don't think it is. And this actually happened to one of our graduate teaching assistants. He had messaged me for some advice on what to do with this. So this is based on a real scenario. Kids need to think for themselves. So one other thing to kind of be thinking about is how you might approach this particular student. I'll go ahead and give you the advice that I gave to the GTA. I said in this particular case, one thing that you could do is comment on the paper and give it feedback. Kind of hitting all of the things that you notice. This sounds generic. There are no specific details. Um, and maybe there's something going on with the actual writing itself, like the style. This doesn't seems to be you. This doesn't sound like you. And the reason why is because this was a draft, so it wasn't the final draft. The other thing about the context for this particular student is that they actually had not been in class the entire semester. They had missed a lot of in-person classes. So this was a draft. It wasn't the final draft. So there was the possibility of revising this. So because we were at that revision stage, the probably what I suggested is like, just go ahead and they have to rewrite it, obviously. They have to revise it anyway. Now you might take a different approach yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that. Ooh, I see. Diana said, I had a similar assignment to this, and I had two students in two separate classes turn in the assignment with almost the exact generic phrasing. Oh, wow. Maybe they actually copied and pasted each other's paper. Cynthia says, I've had to deal with this very issue. I tried to have a gentle conversation with the student, and the student wouldn't respond. I definitely left the door open for a discussion. That's really good. I'm really glad that you actually did that to have a conversation. Sarah says, do you have a different view of this with middle school students? That's actually a really good question because we're thinking about, those students who are in seventh and eighth grade or sixth grade as well. Um, and I'm kind of like thinking about what are some ways to actually engage our seventh and eighth graders if they're actually using AI. And I think some of those things, some of the things that we said before about like that conversation is really important still. And I also kind of wonder, um, I'm thinking also about like where the parents are in this conversation too. Should they actually be added as part of this response to the possible use of generative AI? So, in this particular scenario, that was my own idea on how we could actually respond and really listening to the student. So, just in the interest of time, what I'll go ahead and do is kind of go to other different types of approaches that you can take. Like, say, for example, you have a lot of students that you actually teach, and you're kind of wondering, well, what exactly can I actually do? Because, if you have a lot of students and you think that there's a lot of use of AI based on that detector, how exactly can you approach this? You may not have time for a full-on conversation. So here are some other ideas that I got from a few other colleagues actually who also teach in college. Our biggest thing when it comes to teaching writing is that metacognition, um, reflecting back on your process and understanding your process. So one particular example is having students annotate their draft for you, focusing on their rhetorical choices. And this is before you use GPT-0 or some other AI detector. And this is actually kind of like really interesting to me because when I heard this, it's because it has the student submit a draft for peer review. And usually what they then do is that there are questions. But instead, you kind of like go through each draft and say, this is what I'm trying to do in this paragraph. This is what I'm trying to do in this paragraph. So they're kind of like forced to think about the text and what it does. And this is especially helpful if maybe they're using an AI detector or an AI system. They actually have to look at the text and have to think through what they're doing. Another example is if you have used something like GPT-0, students might meet a particular threshold of suspected Gen AI use. So, as an example, a 6% probability. Maybe in your policy, you say, hey, I'm using an AI detector. If it meets 20% probability for your text, I'm going to go back and ask you to revise and annotate the draft focusing again on the rhetorical choices that you're making along the way. I think what we really are doing as writing instructors is not so much as always the product, but also thinking about the process. What exactly are students doing? Why they make the choices that they actually make? I think the benefit of college education or education just really in general is kind of like thinking about your failures and successes and not just getting things done. So there has to be kind of like a cultural shift, I think, for us and also our students, where it's not always just about the grades or the GPA, but it's also about like real authentic learning and thinking. If students ever actually kind of think about their own relationship with learning and everything. It's a little ideal in some ways, but I think a cultural shift is necessary. And that's the only way I think that we can kind of think about generative AI in this particular context. So, one thing I do want to advocate for is just making small changes if you ever feel overwhelmed and there's a lot of things I have to do. James Lang's small teaching makes a very interesting argument where it's just making small changes. You don't have to rewrite the entire class, but really rethink just like small things that you can actually do. And I see some people say it's a great book. Um, I really think for us, we have like the different tools that helps us in our teaching in a world of generative AI. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop there and take any questions that you actually might have. And I'll also stop sharing my screen so that way we can actually see everybody, or you can see me in a different view.
I'm back, Antonio. Yeah, so many questions coming in. It's kind of impressive.
Yeah.
I do want to really quickly address a couple of things that have been going back and forth in chat and also in the Q&A, and that is, can the chat be shared out, the transcript for the chat? There's so much good conversation happening. So I will plan to share a transcript of the chat when I share out the recordings, which will be by email on Monday. And then the other thing was your slides. Everyone really wants a copy of your slides. So if it's all good, if you wouldn't mind sending me a copy of the slides, I can then forward that to people with the recording as well. There was a lot of interest in some of the links that you were sharing. People can't obviously click on those links in Zoom, so
Right, right.
they were very interested in that. So we will make sure that the slides and the chat transcript get shared out as
Mhm.
well as the recording. So yeah, so great. I have several questions here. I mean, there's just so many. There's currently 93 open questions. Some of those are about the chat,
Right.
um, um, but I did pick out a few that I thought were particularly interesting. There was a question about actually incorporating this sort of thing and the kind of principles that you're talking about into peer assessment and whether
Ooh.
there's a way to do that in a class. There was another question related. I think of it as related. What do you do when you have a class of 600 people? And
Mm.
how do these principles work in that kind of situation? So if you wouldn't mind addressing those, that'd be great.
Yeah, the interesting thing, those are really good questions, especially both with peer assessment and thinking about what do you do when you have such a huge class to say like 600 people and everything. One of the things that I like to do when it comes to peer assessment, one of the things that's really important is, and it kind of like goes back to that conversation and having with students is, what are the going back to those values? And that's the good thing about doing the values affirmation chart. Like at the very beginning of the semester, you have that for the whole semester or for the whole academic year. It's also kind of like a document that's supposed to be living, as we often say, where throughout the course of the semester, you kind of like do some check-ins. Hey, are we still following these values, these behaviors that we have expected of us? What are some things that we might actually need to change? And then what I've noticed, this is with peer review, but I think it can apply to peer assessment. Students also kind of actually do use those values when they're interacting with each other. So when we're doing peer assessment, I think, of course, you might have your own rubric or you have your own guidelines, but that values chart is really important. When I'm doing my peer assessment, in what ways am I delivering respect to someone else? If I'm doing peer assessment, in what ways am I actually showing some critical feedback on that person's work? You know, and I'll tell you this one little scenario, again, with peer review, but kind of like a similar with peer assessment. I had one student who messaged me in my online class. She said, well, my peer reviewer was really mean. The voice, the tone of their comments on my paper, I really didn't feel good at all about it. And she said, this person violated the values that we have for our class, Dr. Bird. And so that was a moment when I messaged both of them. I said, okay, we need to have a conversation because the values have been violated. I think students really do buy into that, at least in my experience. So really using that throughout the entire semester for each assignment, but also can be used for peer assessment. These particular principles for a class of 600, I have not taught a class of 600 students, but I think these principles can kind of be broken down into smaller groups, for example. So going back to that values chart, if I had a group of 600 students, I would try, and I've done this before with a smaller group, it's kind of like putting together in smaller teams. And in a way, they're kind of like responsible to each other with those particular values that they're actually creating with each other. I do recognize at the same time that that can be kind of hard because sometimes people are really active and they participate in their team, and then you have two or three people who just have have kind of checked out of the class. It happens both online and also in person. But if I had a class of 600, that's how I try to carry out those particular principles, kind of putting folks in those clusters and thinking about their values. And then from there, kind of thinking about how do we structure activities and conversations, especially when we're doing kind of like check-ins with each other.
That's great. Thank you very much. And there's actually a lot of questions kind of generally around the accuracy of AI detectors and what to do in certain cases. For example, you could have foreign students who use something like Grammarly to translate, and then they're getting flagged as 100% AI. When they generated their own work, they just were using something to help them translate to English. And then
Mhm.
there's also questions about, when a student comes to you and says, I didn't use AI, but their score is really high. What do you do in that moment? So can you address that a little bit?
hmm Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to a basic principle. And actually, when I was looking at some other companies for including GPT-0 and looking at some of their articles, one thing is being emphasized is that this is not the only thing to be used in making a decision about what type of grade a student should get or whether or not the an academic integrity complaint should actually be filed with administration. In those instances, I think that's where it's important to do be aware of some of the drawbacks of some of these tools, that they are not perfect in any kind of way. And that's something that that's one reason why I am always reluctant to use AI detectors in my own teaching, is because even though it is like one thing, I want to kind of focus on that conversation with students. Knowing that English language learners, they are often flagged as having used AI with false positives. The student who says I didn't use AI, but 90% of it is AI. That's where you kind of ask, well, did you use like Grammarly, for example? Did you use any kind of AI to clean up your text? Kind of dig deeper into understanding what it is that they did. Because we focus on process, it would be fantastic. And I've been trying to talk about this with my director of comp, is let's have like portfolios. Can we have a portfolio-based assessment where students put in all of the different pieces that represents their process? So, text messages, notes, brainstorming activities, all of that goes into a portfolio. So if you have a visibility on their process, hey, can you show me what's the process? What are the things that you did? That can kind of help you get a better understanding of the student's writing if they did not use AI.
Great. That's awesome. Yeah, I really like the idea of just of this being a pointer as a place where you can start a conversation rather than just using it as an evaluation tool in and of itself.
Right.
Um, I think we have time for maybe one more question. If and this comes from Tammy McAllister, if assignments are given with the goal of developing skill, background knowledge, or showing growth, what is an example of using AI for critical inquiry in a composition, English, or humanities course?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the things that I do in my own teaching is I first, whether it's sometime because I teach online, I create like a little video that explains Gen AI, and it goes very well with the policy that we have for our first year writing class. And it actually kind of lists different activities that you could potentially do with generative AI. So when we actually do an actual assignment, for example, the literature review assignment, I actually give students the option, only the option. I don't require it because I know students are concerned about the energy consumption of AI use. You have the option to use something like Perplexity. You have the option to use something like Research Rabbit, which basically maps out different types of articles as it relates to one main article that you upload. Um, yes, I see some other ideas in the chat on people use for literature review. So I tell them this is an example where you can use the Perplexity for literature review, but it comes with all types of caveats. You still have to look at those sources. You still have to read those sources. But this kind of like helps you get a firmer grasp of the conversation. I think for a lot of students, even in college, literature reviews are hard, I have a hard time with them too. And I've been doing it for a long time. So that's one example where they can try to do some use AI for critical inquiry is in that literature review stage, but it's more of a human in the loop. They have to be involved because some of the sources they get, they're not really good sources. So you have to be careful with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. All right, one other question. Um,
Yeah.
uh, this one just came in, and I really like this question, actually. I'm a programming teacher. It's becoming increasingly hard to get original work. What is the best way to motivate students?
Oh yeah, it's what's the best way to motivate them? That's a really great question. Um, there are a couple of things, and this kind of like comes from me. One thing that I try to do is I tell my students that my classroom is a playground, it's not a boot camp. In other words, this is a space where we can like make mistakes, almost like from the Magic School Bus, make mistakes, get messy, that kind of a thing. And I try to emphasize to them that it is about the process that we're actually trying to do, that we're actually trying to learn. So I do try to provide that eccentric motivation by letting them know, maybe in your other classrooms, you feel like this is a very strict kind of environment. But in this place, I really do want you to kind of like make mistakes along the way. And I think one thing that may have been helpful is the transparency with my students about telling them this is what you can and what you can't do with AI. But this is also really important to know that you have to be a part of that process, leading things and not be letting the machine take things over completely. And then the last thing that I do is I use self-assessments. And one of the questions that I ask students is, hey, can you kind of tell me how you used AI and in what ways? I'm mostly just interested in learning what you are learning, what you're doing. I'm not trying to like report you. I just want to know, given the things that we set up, what is it that you're trying to do? So that's how I try to provide that intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. But I'm hoping that the student has that intrinsic motivation as well to
Yeah,
learn.
yeah, makes sense. That's great. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and close up. So thank you very much, Antonio. This was a very informative talk. We had some really great feedback actually here toward the end. People really grateful for everything you shared. So thank you again. This has been a great way to kick off our program. Um, as we close, a couple of quick notes for everyone. First, I am going to drop a link into the chat to sign up for free access to GPT-0. Please note that the form that you'll see on the other end of that does ask you to include a screenshot or a PDF that shows how you plan to use GPT-0 in your classroom. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. And there's a lot happening in the chat, but if you don't get it, don't worry. You'll get it in an email after the session. So also, when the webinar closes, when I shut down the screen and everything, you'll get a very short survey to let us know how we did. Please do take a minute or two to complete that survey because your feedback means a whole lot to us. And then finally, like I've said before, I will be sharing out links to the recording of today's webinar via email on Monday next week. That will also include a transcript of the chat and Dr. Bird's slides as well. And for those of you in the program, in the certificate program, please do plan to attend our office hours on Friday. They'll be in Zoom again at 12 p.m. Eastern. And if you don't have a link, let me know. But that will actually be a really good opportunity for you to speak with an ML engineer at GPT-0, get some of your questions answered about how GPT-0 itself works. So thank you again for attending today's session. Thank you again, Dr. Bird, for your fantastic presentation. And I look forward to seeing everybody very soon.